Is our first chapter of our book. It starts with chapter 12 because this is the second half of world history. So we're actually going to start a little bit before 1500. So this class is technically 1500 to the present. This chapter, as you can see, it says the worlds of the 15th century. So 15th century, you go back one. So it's actually the 1400s. And what it does is it sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about and focusing on. Basically, where are we at this point in time? So by the time we hit 1500, you have basically an overview of what the world looks like up until this point. There's a lot of information in this PowerPoint because of that, because we basically have to get you caught up to speed with everything that's been going on in the world. So there's a lot. This is a true world history class, so it's not Western Civ, which is maybe something that you've taken before in the past, where it basically focuses on Europe and Europe as it interacts with the rest of the world. So again, it's a lot of information. I tend to give you more information as opposed to less information, but that's good for you as the student. It helps you with your essays, and it helps you with your quizzes. My recommendation would be that if you have a tablet, you can follow along on the PowerPoint version of this, which you can download on D2L, and you can take notes on it and highlight it and circle it, or print it out. You can print out the PowerPoint, write directly on there, or take notes the old-fashioned way. You don't have to write down every single thing, but jot down the big ideas, because that's what you're going to be tested on, and that's what you want to remember. But in any case, I highly recommend you do take some sort of note. Don't just have this lecture playing in the background of whatever else it is you're doing and think, oh, I listened to the lecture. Do follow along, because like I said, it's a lot of information. We're looking at this with a wide lens, and I do put some examples in here. But again, it's a lot of information. So you don't have to write this down. This is just to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about. So by 2016, a number of American cities and the state of Vermont had transformed October 12th from a celebration of Columbus Day to a commemoration of Indigenous Peoples Day. Opposed to many places, such transformations of the holiday reflected a growing debate about the significance and legacy of Columbus. Was he a perpetrator of genocide, a slave trader, a thief, a pirate, and most certainly not a hero, as Winona LaDuke, the president of the Indigenous Women's Network, declared in 1992, which marked the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in Americas? Or should Americans celebrate Columbus, as the Latino novelist and publisher Jonathan Marcantoni recommended in 2015, remembering his achievement of connecting the Europeans with the Americas, because without it, the societies we love would not exist? Well, this is continuing to be a debate even into day. This man here, Columbus, you can stand on both sides of the argument. So Columbus's legacy has been the subject of much debate, obviously, and this continues. His reputation as this heroic discoverer, which up until relatively recent times has been pretty much unchallenged, has started to be challenged. An emphasis instead has been placed on the history of death, slavery, and racism and exploitation that followed his voyage, not just to the native people, but to the African slaves brought in as a result of his voyages as well. And we'll get more into that. Not so much in this chapter. This chapter, again, is really setting the stage, but in the next chapter. So this is a really good reminder that the past is as unpredictable as the future. You can't always assume that one interpretation that maybe you've been taught or I've been taught is going to be the interpretation that's commonly held going into the future. History, it's hard to think of it this way, but it's constantly changing. We discover new texts, or we discover new archaeological finds, or something causes us to change our way of looking at things, or, as in the case with Columbus, society changes, and that causes us to change the way we look at a person who maybe before had been viewed as a hero, and now we have a different view of them. So Columbus's voyage is definitely globally significant, and again, we get more into it later on. But there were also a lot of other empires emerging in the 15th century. So remember, 15th century means 1400s. And as I said before, the purpose here is to review where we are. So technically this class starts at 1500, but it would be really hard to just jump in at 1500, especially since if you've never taken a world history class before, it's kind of hard to jump in at one point. History is all about cause and effect. They've tried to do different things like, teaching history backwards, starting from the present and going back, but it's way too hard because you really have to understand what happened in the past to understand, like, well, how did we get here? So by 1500, the world still had all types of societies. We have hunters and gatherers, we have empires, but the balance between them is going to be different than it had been in the year 500, let's say. And of course, we are in the Common Era, CE, so we won't be talking about BCE, which is before Common Era, which is the same. AD is the same as CE, and BC is the same as BCE. It's just more politically correct. You can use them interchangeably, but we're going to be in the Common Era anyway, so it shouldn't affect. Okay, so again, we have all different types of civilizations in the world by the year 1500. We have some hunters and gatherers that are still in existence in, for instance, Australia and in North America. So for instance, in Australia, you have some 250 different separate groups that are largely living a hunting and gathering lifestyle. They had assimilated outside technologies, but had not adapted agriculture. So agriculture, of course, would have changed them from a hunting and gathering society to an agricultural society. So, of course, that kind of goes without saying. They did have networks of exchange with other groups, and they did have sophisticated sculpture and rock painting. So we have to be careful when, the old view of how to look at a society like this would be that they were in some way not advanced, and that's not the case. That's just them adapting to their particular surroundings. And so they do have a sophisticated culture. It's just not a settled one. There's no settled agriculture. They're, again, hunters and gatherers. Along the northwest coast of North America, we have a pretty abundant environment. So the natural environment allowed for the development of a complex hunting and gathering culture. They had some permanent villages, which is really unique in a hunting and gathering society. Typically, you don't see that. They had economic specialization and hierarchies that sometimes included slavery, chiefdoms, and food storage. So again, that's typically not something you would see in a hunting and gathering society. Typically, they are more nomadic. They have to go where the food is. But because the environment was so abundant, they were able to have settled societies, which again is pretty unique. Elsewhere, farming had advanced and had absorbed Paleolithic lands. So that's not something that's going to be typical for all Native American tribes. Lots of different agricultural societies. So here we're going to switch gears and talk about Africa. So for example, the Igbo, who were an ethnic group living in what is today relatively southern Nigeria, the present-day country of Nigeria, which of course didn't exist at this time. And so by this time, different groups had started to develop small states and urban centers, and the Igbo people were densely populated. They traded, but they purposely rejected kingship and state building, which is unique, as we'll see in this time period. Instead, they relied on titled societies, women's associations, and balanced their power among kingship groups and hereditary experts to create a stateless society. Basically, it's a really interesting construct. And so they're not really in necessarily one homogenous state that you're going to see, such as in Europe. But at the same time, even though they don't have like a common government, they do have shared common artistic traditions and other things that they share, cultural traits, language, etc. And eventually all will shift from a matrilineal to a patrilineal system. So that's from the mother's side to the father's side. There are agricultural societies in North America. So even within a continent, we can't make broad generalizations, maybe in the way that you might a little bit more so in Europe and parts of Asia. You really can't make a broad generalization about a big continent such as Africa or North and South America. So we talked about how there were some tribes in North America that were living a hunting and gathering societies. There were some that lived in agricultural societies, such as the Iroquois. They lived in what is now central New York State, And again, they had an agricultural society. They again had become fully agricultural. They mainly grew maize, corn, and beans by around 1300, and because of this, they experienced population growth and the emergence of distinct peoples. So we a fragmentation of the Iroquois. There is going to be a rise in warfare as the Iroquois grow more populous, and this is key to developing male prestige, which caused the creation of the Iroquois Confederacy. So this is a loose confederation of different Iroquois tribes they had some sort of sovereignty within their own tribes, but they again were loosely bound together under a common chief. And this is something that the European colonists will really take to heart. They liked this idea of limited government, social equality, and personal freedom, which even applied in some instances to women. And so the Iroquois Confederacy is going to be something that directly impacts the creation of our own government. There are pastoral people. So pastoral people are people who largely raise herd animals, goats, cows, etc. Focusing here on Central Asia. So Central Asia is most famous for giving rise to the Mongol Empire, right? Genghis or Chengiz Khan is the one everybody thinks of. They've come and gone by this point that we're talking about. So the big Mongol Empire it's gone. However, there is going to be a Turkic warrior by the name of, Europeans know him as Tamerlane, who wants to restore the Mongol Empire in about 1400. And he does pretty well at that. His army is able to go into Russia, pretty much devastate Russia, Persia, and India. And in 1405, he was actually preparing an invasion of China, which, if you've taken a world history class before, you might know that the Mongols did in fact invade and occupy China for a while, but he actually died before he was able to. His successors were able to keep control of the area between Persia and Afghanistan for a century, so a long time. But his conquest was the last great military success of the Central Asian nomads. Again, this is something the Mongols' time in the sun, I guess, at least in terms of empire building, has really waned by this point, and Tamerlane was kind of an outlier. And in the following centuries, these nomadic people living there, raising their herds, their homeland is going to be swallowed up in an expanding Russian and Chinese empires, depending on what side of the steppe they're on. There are pastoral people in West Africa as well. The Fulbe were West Africa's largest pastoral society. They started a gradual eastward migration after about 1000 CE. They usually lived in small communities among agriculturalists where they would graze their cattle. And so in that way, they're able to exchange their goods with those of the agriculture. However, the tense relationships that would develop with their hosts due to their sense of cultural superiority would lead to some political issues. They are going to gradually adopt Islam. Islam is going to come into especially North Africa, and it's going to be very important in understanding even European politics later on. Some are going to eventually move to towns and become noted religious leaders. North Africa is going to eventually become, and West Africa and parts of East Africa as well, it's going to become a center of Islamic learning, which a lot of people kind of don't associate with Africa. And a series of jihads in the 18th and 19th century are going to create new states ruled by the Fulbe. And these are modern Fulbe herdsmen. So again, pastoralists are people who raise herds of some kind. It could be cattle, it could be sheep, any kind of herd animal. So we've looked at different kinds of civilizations, hunters and gatherers, small agricultural societies, pastoral people, but by the 15th century, a majority of the world's population lived within a major civilization, and a lot of these are going to be empires, or if they're not empires, they're going to become empires. So, looking at China. So, prior to the time period that we're talking about, China had been badly disrupted by Mongol rule. Remember, I mentioned before that the Mongols had invaded and occupied China for a time, and also due to plague. We are experiencing a lot of that, issues with modern pandemics. This was something that was very, very much commonplace in the past that people had to contend with. There was a recovery underway under the Ming Dynasty, which lasted from 1368 all the way to 1644. China is an old civilization, and it, of course, goes back way farther than the time period we're talking about. So we've kind of just jumped in pretty much the middle of their history here. Their focus initially was an effort to eliminate all signs of foreign rule, of course, get rid of the embarrassment that they felt for having to fall to the Mongols, which they saw as these barbaric people. And so they want to, in a way, go back to their roots. They're going to promote Confucian learning, this traditional philosophical way of looking at the world. And the Emperor Yang Li is going to be really instrumental in this. And he also sponsored an 11,000 volume of an encyclopedia summarizing all the wisdom of the past. So again, we're going to try to get rid of that whole, what happened with the Mongols. We're going to go back to our proud traditional past as a large and strong empire. They also did this by reestablishing the civil service examination system. You may or may not know about this, but the Chinese had a very, as it says in the next point, highly centralized government. And you did not have to be an aristocrat or a wealthy person in order to serve in high-ranking government positions. And that was due to this civil service examination system. So you would literally take a test. It's kind of like taking the SAT or the ACT. And it would determine whether or not you had what it takes to help rule China. And again, technically speaking, you could be anybody, but of course you had to have the means by which to study for this exam. So usually it was people from wealthy families, but again, technically it could be anybody because a wealthy family could sponsor a less fortunate child to study up and to take part in this. But again, they had a very highly centralized government. Great power was given to court eunuchs. If you don't know what that is, you might want to just Google it really quick so I don't have to get into it here. The state did restore land to cultivation. They did a lot. They constructed waterworks. They planted perhaps about 1 billion trees in a very strangely eco-friendly move that we really aren't used to seeing in the past. And this was perhaps the best governed and most prosperous civilization of the 15th century. So why weren't the Chinese the ones who made the discovery of North and South America? Because, of course, Europe, Asia, Africa, they all know about each other and have known about each other for hundreds and thousands. They know each other exists. They've been trading. This has been going on. But the civilizations of North and South America, they don't know anything about that, and the civilizations of North and South America, vice versa. Well, China may have been the first. We have some evidence, but we'll explain why it wasn't them first. So, the Chinese did sponsor some maritime ventures. So, Chinese sailors and traders had become important in the South China Sea and southeastern Asian ports in the 11th century. And they did commission a large fleet, which was launched in 1405. It was captained by a Muslim eunuch by the name of Zheng He. And its purpose was to engage distant people in a Chinese tribute system. So not necessarily bring them under, make a Chinese overseas empire, but basically to have spheres of influence. Like, hey, you're going to pay tribute to us, and in exchange, we'll give you some military protection and whatnot, and trading privileges, etc. So again, it's not necessarily an empire, it's more of a sphere of influence. Why they didn't want an empire, why they weren't an overseas empire, I should say, because they had a mainland empire. Why didn't they want an overseas one like the Europeans are? We're going to get to that in a second. So you can see here all the different routes, those ocean routes that you see in blue are going to be all the different maritime ventures that they have. Again, I mentioned before, maybe they made it all the way to North and South America. We have some evidence of that. It's not great. It's not like a slam dunk, like, yes, they were definitely here. So we can't say for sure whether or not they were actually first to make that contact. So why Why didn't it go any further than that? Well, the Chinese government really abruptly stopped the voyages in 1433. A lot of people saw them as a waste of resources. We'll get more into this in a second when we compare, we do more comparing China and Europe. But basically, they didn't need to. So we'll talk about Europe a little bit later on and their need for resources. But China had a lot of resources that Europe did not. So they're like, well, we don't really need an overseas empire. I mean, it's great to go out and explore, but it's not necessary. It's a waste of money. So they stopped sponsoring them. And so that's going to be something that really causes Europe to diverge from China, when again, China was the civilization that you would expect. If you didn't know what was going to happen and you looked at the world at this time, you would think that China was going to be the ones to do that. And that's, of course, as we know, not what happened. And this is a very slimmed down version of what happened. If you're interested in learning more about it, there's a very good book called The Great Divergence that really examines this in detail. I read it for graduate school. It can be a little dry at times because, like I said, I mean, it really goes into it, talking about like rice cultivation and all that. But for our purposes here, this is good enough. Okay. So a similar process is going on in Europe, a process of demographic recovery, because of course we know that the Great Bubonic Plague had swept through periodically through Europe throughout the 14th century. And so Europe is still recovering from that. And there's going to be a cultural flowering in terms of the Renaissance and a general European expansion, particularly in Western Europe. Population is going to start to rise again in about 1450. And there's going to be a great deal of state building. However, it's going to be fragmented. There's going to be a lot of independent and very competitive states that are going to be driven by war. And that's another difference between Europe and China. China doesn't really have that drive of, they are the main empire on the scene in Asia. And so there's not that competition to drive them forward either. So this is a map that shows us the state of Europe at the time. As you can see, it's very different than the modern map of Europe. Of course, the Holy Roman Empire being the biggest difference. Also, Italy, you will note, is not it's not a state. It's broken up into many different states, and this map is going to change a lot, as we shall see. All right. So at the time, Europe is in the midst of the European Renaissance, which was a reclamation of the classical Greco-Roman tradition. So it's interesting here. We can see a lot of parallels between China and Europe. China is also trying to go back to their roots, right? Trying to get rid of that stain of the Muslim rule and go back to a better time as they saw it. And Europe is also doing that to a certain extent. It begins in the commercial cities of Italy. Again, we're using the term Italy here, even though technically there is no unified Italy. So the commercial cities such as Florence and Venice in about 1350 to 1500. And the idea is a returning to the sources as a cultural standard to imitate. We're going to go back to these ancient classical Greek and Roman texts and culture, and we're going to revive it. And that's what Renaissance means, a rebirth. There's going to be a turn to greater naturalism in art. Think about the very famous artwork of Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo. And humanist scholars, as they were known, explored secular topics in addition to religious matters. And there's any number of scholars who are looking at this. Again, we're going through this pretty fast because technically by 1500, the Renaissance is over. So we're not going to dive really deep into the Renaissance here. And there were a lot of different ones. I mentioned Christine de Pizan just because she's a woman. She was not the only woman humanist scholar at the time, but she spoke out particularly against misogyny. And Renaissance thinkers were more concerned with describing the world as it was rather than exploring eternal truth. So here's a quote from Christine de Pizan and her famous book, City of Ladies. No matter which way I looked at it, I could find no evidence from my own experience to bear out such a negative view of female nature and habits. Even so, I could scarcely find a moral work by any author who didn't devote some chapter or paragraph to attacking the female sex. So, ahead of her time, of course, but she's not the only one. There are others. There are other very strong female Renaissance writers that, again, A, we have a broad lens because we have a lot of information to cover in a short amount of time. And B, this is technically before the time period we're talking about. So we're just basically doing a review here. But if you're somebody who really likes history and that's why you're taking this class and you're going to major in it, the further up you go in your history classes, the more specific they get. So I know in my undergrad, for instance, I took several classes particular to the Renaissance. So if you're interested in something in particular, you're going to major or minor in history, never fear. You'll get to look more into it the further along you get. All right, so European maritime voyages begin with the Portuguese in 1415, largely because of the works of Prince Henry the Navigator, a Portuguese prince who was really into navigating, as his name suggests. By 1492, Columbus had reached the Americas, and by 1497, Vasco da Gama began sailing around Africa to India. Again, we're not really getting into the particularities here. This is technically before our time period, but many reasons why they began exploring. The main one being that they had lost a lot of access to overseas routes due to actions by different Islamic groups in the Middle East. And so they were looking for ways to access China by bypassing those overland routes. Hence, they took to the sea, started going around Africa, and eventually got the idea to go west to reach the east. Of course, they knew the world was round by this point. So you can see the different Portuguese voyages over there in the gold lines, and the Chinese voyages are over here in the blue lines. All right, so let's get more into the nitty-gritty of comparing them, because again, if you were looking at this objectively without knowing what you know, I would really think the Chinese are more in, they would have more ability to do some overseas exploration and to reach North and South America. So why was it the Europeans? Well, European voyages were a lot smaller compared to Chinese ones in terms of fleet size, so that means less money needing to be invested. And unlike the Chinese, the Europeans were also seeking wealth, converts to Christianity, and allies in the Crusades against Islam, which the Chinese were not. There wasn't, again, the wealth. They had a lot of wealth internally. They had a lot of resources, so they didn't need to go out and search for them. And they didn't have that desire for conversion that the Europeans had as well. Additionally, the Europeans used violence to carve out empires that the Chinese not. Again, they weren't really interested in overseas empire building. It was more of spheres of influence. And again, the biggest one, Chinese voyages ended due to lack of government support, whereas the European ones kept going. There also is no overarching political authority in Europe to end the voyages. Say the Portuguese government decided to stop sponsoring voyages. Well, you still have Spain. You still have England. You still have France. You still have all these other countries that can say, well, if you're not going to do it, we're going to do it. And going off of that, the rivalry between the states encouraged more explorations. One of the reasons why Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain sponsored Columbus's voyage in the first place. Additionally, much of Europe's elite were very interested in overseas expansion for resources and empire building again. And again, a big point being China had everything it needed, whereas the Europeans wanted the greater riches of the East. China's food production could expand internally, whereas the European system expanded by acquiring new lands. And that's really the big takeaway here. Okay. We haven't yet talked about the Islamic world, so we will switch gears here and talk about the Islamic world, and then we will end up talking about the major empires of North and South America. So the long fragmented Islamic world had eventually crystallized into 4 major states or empires. So again, we're kind of hopping in here. We are past the point in which Muhammad had established his teachings and gained a following and established those initial Islamic empires. So there was some fragmentation, and now we're going back into empire building. So in the Islamic heartland of the Middle East, you have the Ottoman and the Safavid empires. The Ottoman Empire lasts a long time, pretty much all the way through, all the way up to World War I, and it fragments in World War I, which we'll talk about. So, long time. It's a huge territory going from Anatolia to in southeastern Europe, much of the Middle East, into North Africa, lands around the Black Sea. It's big, and I have a map, so you can get a better idea if you have no idea what I'm saying in a second here. The sultans claimed the title of caliph and the legacy of the Abbasids, which were a dynasty from prior to this You don't really need to know a ton about them, so don't worry if you've never heard of them before. But it was their goal to bring unity to the Islamic world, because remember, they had unity. That's what the reference to the Abbasids are. It fragmented, and now they're trying to bring that unity back to the Islamic. Okay, so here again, I promised you a map. Here it is. This is the Islamic world in 1500. We're focusing here on the Ottoman Empire, which is in green. Okay, the Ottomans had a lot of aggression towards Christian lands. The fall of Constantinople in 1453, it was a huge sore spot on the Europeans' pride that they had lost Constantinople, which was the last outpost of the Roman Empire, and they had lost it to a Muslim group. In 1529, they actually sieged the city of Vienna. They were unable to capture it, but again, this idea that they are encroaching on European lands was pretty much terrifying. And so overall, the Europeans really feared Turkish expansion. And here we have the Ottoman Turks storming the walls of Constantinople in 1453, which again will remain a sore spot for Europe. All right, the Safavid Empire emerged in Persia, so I'll show you the map again here in a second. From the Sufi religious order, so it's like to the east of the Ottoman Empire. The Sufi religion, the empire was established shortly after 1500, and it imposed Shia Islam as the official religion of the state. And this is important because the Ottoman Empire followed the Sunni tradition of Islam, whereas the Safavid followed the Shia tradition. And this religious hostility between the groups continues today. It goes back, it's complicated, but again, in a nutshell, we have a wide lens here. The idea is who can be caliph or ruler. The Shia believe that it has to be a descendant of Muhammad, whereas the Sunnis believe it can be any righteous Muslim. Okay, so there's the map again to give you an idea of where we're talking about. You can see it's to the east of the Ottoman Empire. All right, the Songhai Empire is also a Muslim empire, and it is in West Africa, was in West Africa, and it emerged in the second half of the 15th century. I say it's a Muslim empire, but Islam was largely limited to the upper class urban elite, so it's the religion of the ruling class. Everybody else tended to not be Muslim. Soni Ali followed Muslim practices, but was also regarded as a magician with an invisibility charm, and he ruled from 1465 to 1492. So you can see here is a lot of blending of local traditions, local mysticisms with the belief in Islam. And Songhai was a major trading center of Islamic learning and trade. So again, we tend to think of these big Islamic empires, and you tend to think of like the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, but there were other Muslim empires in Africa which promoted Islamic learning and the faith. So again, that would be located in West Africa. There is also a large Muslim empire in India, the Mughal Empire. It was created by a Turkic group that invaded India in 1526, and over the 16th century, they gained control of much of India. And you can see the map here shows you the different stages in which they built their empire, and it will eventually include much of India. And here they did have a considerable effort to create a partnership between Hindus and Muslims. However, of course, there were religious tensions that are actually ongoing within the Indian subcontinent to this day. So this age of the four great Muslim empires is sometimes called a second flowering of Islam. It's a new age of political coherence. Again, you have four large empires, strong military power, economic prosperity, and cultural brilliance. It also spread Islam to new areas such as Southeast Asia, and gave rise to many different centers of learning that is going to in turn help to spread the faith into different territories. Okay, the last part of the world that we'll talk about is going to be North and South America. We briefly mentioned some North American groups, but we're focusing here on large empires, and so we can't talk about North and South America and large empires without talking about the Aztec and the Incan Empire. They were established by once marginal people in both cases who took over and absorbed older cultures. So we'll start with the Aztec Empire. So the Mexica were a semi-nomadic people who migrated southward from northern Mexico into the region in which will become the Aztec Empire, which I'll show you a map in a second. They built themselves up and they established a new capital city of Tenochtitlan. They are eventually going to form a triple alliance between themselves and two other city-states to unite and create the Aztec Empire, which again here is a map over here to the right. And after that, they launched a program of military conquest. And they were able to conquer much of Mesoamerica under a century, so a very, very short amount of time. And again, you can see the considerable size of the Aztec Empire in this map. And Aztec rulers claimed descent from earlier peoples to give them a mystic quality, a spiritual quality, as well as a political power. However, on the negative side, the Aztec Empire was loosely structured an unstable conquest state. It had a population of 5 to 6 million, but a lot of those people are conquered people, and conquered people often have resentment to their conquerors. They resent having to now be no longer an independent nation and be part of another group. And so that's going to be key in understanding why the conquistadors were able to come in and to defeat them, despite their vast size and power. The capital city alone had between 150,000 to 200,000 people. That's not a lot today, but even by European standards at this time, that's a lot of people. And they had local and long-distance trade on a very vast scale. Their trade, however, included slaves. Many of them were intended for human sacrifice. It's much more prominent in the Aztec Empire than it had been in earlier traditions. It existed, but certainly not on this scale. And so the idea, they had a cyclical view of the world. And so they believed that in order to rejuvenate the world, that their gods required human sacrifice. All right. So the Incan Empire, which is to the south, whereas the Aztec Empire is in Mesoamerica or Central America, this is in South America. So the Quichua speakers are going to establish the Incan Empire along the length of the Andes. It's like a long, thin empire. I'll show you a map in a second. The empire was 2,500 miles long, and it encompassed around 10 million subjects. And their empire was more bureaucratic and centralized than the Aztec. So bureaucracy refers to like different specializations within a government. So you can think of like the bureaucracy of America, including like all the different like the CDC and the FDA, like all these different groups which organize and control different parts of our day-to-day life. Of course, Machu Picchu is going to be the most famous city of the Incan Empire, just because it's a big tourist spot in the world. Their emperor was an absolute ruler and was regarded as divine within the Incan Empire. The state theoretically owned all land and resources, so there's no private ownership of land and resources, obviously. They organized their empire into 80 provinces. Each had a separate governor in the same way that we have separate states, and each state has a governor and its own governmental structure. Subjects were grouped into hierarchical units with 10, 50, 100, 500 people, at least in the central regions. Inspectors would come in and check up on provincial officials to make sure that nobody was, plotting some sort of rebellion. They took population data and they recorded it using knotted cords. So they didn't have a system of writing, but they did have record keeping. And a massive resettlement program is going to move much of the population. And so there is going to be some unsettled parts of the population by the time the conquistadors come in. The Incas did, however, attempt cultural integration. Conquered people had to learn their language. Sons were taken to Cusco, which was the capital, for acculturation. So acculturation is where you take on aspects of a new culture. And it's acculturation, it's not assimilation. Assimilation is where you just completely take on a new culture. Acculturation is where you're generally adopting a new culture, but you still can keep some aspects of your original culture. But still, again, there's an idea of we want to bring these conquered people within our empire and make them a part of the Incan Empire. And they had to acknowledge major Incan deities as well. So they had to take on the faith of the people. So to compare the two, both the Incan and the Aztec civilizations practiced gender parallelism. So what does that mean? Women and men operate in separate but equivalent spheres. So they had parallel religious cults for men and women, parallel hierarchies of female and male political officials, for instance. So it's not so much like we have men at the top and then you have women at the bottom. They have their own entirely separate social, political, and religious spheres in which they have their own hierarchies that are specific to their gender. Women's household tasks were not regarded as inferior, as you will see in European tradition. However, despite this, men still had top positions in political and religious life, and this is probably largely due to the glorification of the military, which was the province for men only, and this really undermined any kind of like true gender equality as we would see it in the modern world. However, the Incan ruler and his wife governed jointly and were descended from the sun and the moon, respectively, instead of, having a king with a queen, but they're not really ruling at the same time. They're not equal partners. So, again, it's not gender equality the way we would see it in the modern world, but it's very important. There's a saying in history that the past is like a foreign country. So you can't look at the past and try to impose your own worldview on it. It is what it is. So this was this is the way their society was constructed. All right, so to review kind of where we are in the world. Large-scale political systems are bringing together culturally different people. Eventually, of course, with Columbus's voyage, it's going to bring North and South America into those spheres. But prior to that, you have widespread trading within North and South America, and you have widespread trading independently between Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Religion both united and divided far-flung peoples. So you have the common religious culture of Christianity is going to bring a lot of people together, especially when European nations came together to fight the Ottomans, for instance. However, it did divide Rome into Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, and also with Protestant and Catholics. Buddhism also linked people in China, Korea, Tibet, Japan, and other parts of Southeast Asia. Islam was particularly good at bringing together its people. Part of the pillars of Islam, which are the main tenets of the Islamic faith, includes an annual Hajj, or a pilgrimage to Mecca. And so, of course, that is a physical bringing together of people. However, the conflict between the Sunni Ottoman Empire and the Shia Safavid Empire will persist, and Sunnis versus Shia, that conflict today. So you can see the different regions that we talked about here being broken up into the different religious groups. But you can see, despite there being different religious groups, you can see the vast trade routes that existed between Europe and Africa and Asia. I mean, they are extensive. Patterns of trade were definitely evident in the 15th century, as the map just saw. Trade's going on everywhere. However, the balance of the Afro-Eurasian trade was changing. So this is very important. The Silk Road network was contracting due to the breaking up of the Mongol Empire, and plague reduced the product in demand. And so because of this, ocean trade in the West Atlantic and Indian Ocean is going to pick up. Larger ships allowed for trade in bulk, and so you're going to see emerging a lot of complex partnerships and credit, and common Islamic culture going to smooth commerce, and all this is going to happen slowly over time. However, no 15th century connections were truly global. That's only going to come with the European expansion in the 16th century, in which they really start establishing colonies in North and South America. From 1500 on, there is an inextricable linking of the worlds of Afro-Eurasia, the Americas, Pacific Oceania, and that's going to have a lot of consequences for the world. And that's pretty much what we're going to be talking about also. So when you take a class that's any kind of world history or European history, whatever kind of history from 1500 on, it's usually referred to as modern. And this is why. Modern, as we call it, human society emerged first in Europe in the 19th century and then throughout the world. The core feature is going to be industrialization, which includes a quickening technological innovation, huge energy and raw material consumption, which is going to be driving that need for overseas empire, a scientific world outlook, and a massive population increase coupled with fast urbanization, which is the rapid growth of cities. There's going to be widespread commercialization, the dominance of Europeans on the world stage. This Eurocentric worldview is something that we're going to be revisiting and looking at a lot. Another great book for this is Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. It's pretty popular, but it explores, again, in more detail, why Europe? Why was Europe able to have all these overseas empires? Really, really good book. It is not Eurocentric, if you're worried about that. It really looks at, well, it's not any kind of superiority. It's just a variety of factors that enabled them to do it. And it has nothing to do with any kind of superiority by any means. I would never promote a book like that, but check it out if you're interested. European states are going to become more powerful and intrusive. There's going to be a self-conscious departure from tradition. And this revolution is going to be as important as the agricultural revolution. And if you don't remember what that is, that's way back when in prehistory when we figured out how to plant crops. So that was a big deal. This is a big deal. Okay, so that leads to our first chapter question. So in your book, read sources 12.2, 3, 4, and 5. They're short. Don't worry, it's not a lot. They go from pages 529 to 535, and then respond in the discussion board to the following question. What role did the Islamic world play in the emerging identity of European civilization? So we really want to get at, throughout this class, these webs of connection that these different civilizations had with one another. So to that end, respond to that question after you have listened to this lecture.